Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to the After Area Studies Conversation between Asian and Asian American Studies lecture series, a series hosted by the Asian Studies program here at Northeastern University. It's wonderful to see you all in the audience today, online and offline. My name is Doreen Lee, and I'm an anthropologist of Southeast Asia and the acting director of the Asian Studies program here at Northeastern. I'd also like to introduce our Associate Director of Asian American Studies, Professor Denise Kaur, whose work we heard earlier this semester when she gave the first talk in this series on trans-Pacific convergences in Japanese American film. Today's talk, titled Skin Memories of War, by Professor Thuy Linh Nguyen Tu, is the third lecture in our series and will close the fall portion of our series. We will be continuing our program in the spring semester, and I invite you all to join us again in February. I'm very honored to introduce our guest today. Professor Tu is Professor of American Studies in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University. She is the author of Experiments in Skin, Race and Beauty in the Shadows of Vietnam, published by Duke University Press in 2021. She's also the author of The Beautiful Generation, Asian Americans and the Cultural Economy of Fashion, also published by Duke in 2011. She's also the co-editor of several volumes of fascinating titles, such as Fashion and Beauty in the Time of Asia, Alien Encounters, Popular Culture in Asian America, and Technicolor, Race and Technology in Everyday Life. Her work has explored the significance of aesthetics and race as bodily performance, commodity, and historical legacy. Most recently, Professor Tu won the R.R. Hawkins Prize from the Association of American Publishers for her book, Experiments in Skin, which links the history of warfare and beauty between the U.S. and Vietnam. And that's the book she's going to be talking about today with us. Professor Tu, thank you for traveling all the way to Boston to give this talk in person. We're so excited, and thank you for engaging with our Northeastern community. I'd like to say a few quick words about the significance of this speaker series, After Area Studies, which continues the work of the inaugural lecture series that Asian Studies organized last year, titled Asia, America, and the World. This year, we wanted to highlight interdisciplinary conversations about Asia in a global context, with an emphasis on linking Asian studies to Asian American studies. Offering a focus on global connections, this lecture series explores how studies that approach Asia imaginatively have redefined the boundaries of our geopolitical imaginations and extended our disciplinary formations. And central to the conversation is the possibility of engaging activism and social justice within the scholarship on global Asia. At each talk, we ask the following key questions to the speaker. We invite our speakers to situate their work in relation to key debates and explorations between Asian studies, Asian American studies, and other emerging fields. We also ask them to consider how scholarship intersects with activism and social justice work. And finally, we ask our speakers to think about the political, intellectual, and ethical needs of scholarship now and in the future. My colleague Denise Kaur will be asking these questions to Professor Tu immediately following the talk, and then we'll open up the questions and answers, which I will moderate. So some quick acknowledgements are in order. This is a long list of thanks. This series is supported by the Dean's Office at CSSH, and I'd like to thank the events team here. Jen Grieve, Rachel Robson, Tanya Mungia, Najima Hollis Huggins, Max Olivier from the CSSH Dean's Office, and then Kenny Zeng and Mim Merchant from the Asian Studies program. I'd like to thank the ASL interpreters here, Lena Jenny and Jen Gibbons, for coming to Northeastern today to support the accessibility of this event. And lastly, I thank our generous co-sponsors from the Departments of History, Sociology and Anthropology, Culture, Society and Global Studies, Philosophy and Religion, the Humanities Center, and the Africana Studies program. And please, everyone, if you haven't signed in yet, please do so, because we'll be having a book raffle at the end of this event where we'll be giving away signed copies of Professor Tu's book. All right. Professor Tu, welcome to Northeastern. We really look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank
you. Thank you so much, Doreen, for that introduction and for the invitation to come share my work with you all today. It's really such an honor for me to be here at Northeastern, where I've actually never visited, and it's an especial honor to be a part of this dynamic conversation that Doreen and Denise have crafted here at Northeastern. And I am so excited to learn more from you guys about what you're doing here and how you're sort of imagining these connections that have been so important to my own work. So today I'm going to talk to you about my book, Experiments in Skin, Race and Beauty in the Shadows of Vietnam, which was also something of an experiment for me. When I first began working on this book, I thought I was going to study the beauty industry in Vietnam as a way to think about luxury consumption in a post-socialist state. But when I first started doing my research, which was about 3 decades after the Vietnamese state instituted economic reforms called Đổi Mới, or renovation, that shifted the country towards a socialist market economy, one of the most visible ways that you could see the changes, these economic changes, was through the movement of new consumer goods into the country and the frenzy of building that facilitated such movements. Malls, boutiques, restaurants, and high-rises, and everywhere you turn, there seemed to be a new development project. It was as if the city was growing a new skin, covering over the wounds of war, colonialism, occupation, offering instead an image of Vietnam as a sovereign state and an ascendant economy in the Pacific region. Now, of course, the skin didn't just grow, it had to be built. And I met many of the women who did this building at a small spa called Calyx, who were employed in service and factory work, serving in restaurants, cleaning hotels, and sewing clothes, working to shore up this new economy. They were breathing in air from smokestacks, touching preservatives in textile, handling pesticides in food and farming. They were showing up at this spa with all kinds of skin conditions, which the esthetician diagnosed was the result of weak skin. So having observed the ways that men in post-war Vietnam were trying to remake the city's surface with their muscular development, and the ways women were trying to rebuild their own body's surface through these practices of consumption and care, both to very limited success, I began to wonder what kind of histories were showing up on these women's skin or being concealed by the remade Saigon. Skin became for me a hermeneutic through which I could access material traces of the past to grasp the legacy of the Vietnam War as an embodied effect for the U.S. soldiers and Vietnamese women, and in fact, for all of us. So once I met the women at Calyx, my research interest shifted. I became curious about the ways that skin could record the violence of war and development and how we've come to learn and read and remediate its effects on our surface. Let me explain. So the environmental historian David Biggs has characterized the Vietnam War as, in many sense, a chemical war, in which, quote, chemicals were everywhere. In explosives and incendiaries, in tear gas and firebombs, in herbicides and insecticides. Some, like the defoliant TCDD, now infamously known as Agent Orange, were at the time considered non-lethal. Others, like napalm and CS tear gas, meant to drive out enemy soldiers from their hiding places by causing asphyxiation, were intentionally lethal. The use of these weapons raised concerns from the very beginning that the U.S. was crossing a line in Vietnam, violating the 1925 Geneva Protocol's prohibition against the first use of chemical weapons in war. And yet, their deployment only proliferated as the conflict wore on. The Army's increased reliance on these chemicals over the course of this nearly 20-year war, ostensibly deployed to protect U.S. soldiers, damaged their bodies, in many cases for generations to come. These various toxins, which infiltrated land and war and were ingested through food, inhaled in the air, absorbed through the skin while U.S. soldiers were stationed in Vietnam, lingered long after they left. But during the war, these effects were already visible. They appeared most often as skin diseases. You can see some of the visual evidence of this at the National Archives in the boxes of photographs stored under the title, quote, Army Medical Activities and Military and Civilian Life in Southeast Asia from 1965 to 1982, for instance. The photos document the work of U.S. military medical units operating in Japan, South Korea, Thailand, and other locations in Southeast Asia during the war. They depict various wounded soldiers, surgeries, medical offices, and medical conditions, but especially well represented are images of feet, crusty, inflamed, red, and pus-filled, indicating a dermatitis so common as to earn the nickname patty foot, and yet so excruciating as to immobilize soldiers for days, even weeks. So here's some examples of these. So if you've ever been to the archives, right, you'll see this is how they store sort of slides of film. There's boxes and boxes of this stuff. It's all these kind of mangled up feet, right? Here's a close-up of one of those images. During the war, skin diseases were in fact the single most common medical condition among troops, causing the most man-days lost. Soldiers' feet were especially vulnerable, particularly among those stationed in the wet, humid Mekong Delta, but their entire bodies could be racked by dermatitis, and they were routinely evacuated for so-called tropical acne, a severe form of acne that could not be treated by any known remedy but disappeared on its own when they left Vietnam. So here's an example of tropical acne. And one of the things that it distinguishes is that it tends to appear on the body rather than on the face. The Army formed a military dermatology research program in 1964 to determine the causes of these conditions through various experiments in skin. It was tasked with studying environmental factors known from past military incursions to have caused cutaneous injuries, heat, rain, as well as the effects of new, quote, chemical warfare agents and other potentially hazardous substances encountered in the modern military unit. In 1968, the program established a field dermatology research team sent to the Mekong Delta to bring back water, soil, and bacteriological material for study. So here's an image, some images of the film of the team, and this is the field team's labs. While treating soldiers and civilians in combat conditions, the field team claimed to have gathered evidence that cutaneous conditions affected white soldiers most. African American soldiers and Vietnamese people in general were either immune to illness or happily tolerant of it. They went on to publish a massive text called Skin Diseases in Vietnam, in which pictures like this, where as you can see, the little boy is standing in knee-deep in water holding a rat, right? Tells a story of how they're sort of so acclimated to these conditions that they never had skin diseases. With their heightened vulnerability, white soldiers in Vietnam needed protection that would be, in the words of the program's director, lauded dermatologist Marion Sulzberger, quote, infinitely secure, medically endowed, so that the soldier, were he to be stripped suddenly naked, would still carry substantial degrees of protection. They needed, Sulzberger proposed, quote, an armor of skin, an impenetrable shield capable of withstanding all the ravages of war. And this, it's an image that's really, it's difficult to see, but it's an image that accompanied the Sulzberger's presentation to the Department of Defense, right? And here you can see this soldier, right? And he's protected, right, by his skin from all of these conditions of war. And he's called the idiophyllactic soldier, which means, the self-protected soldier. My book uncovers the program's work, which never produced a perfect armor, sealing the vulnerable white male soldier underneath, but did help to reassert a biological basis for race and to globalize ideas about bodily difference. It thus helped to extend long-standing racial ideologies at a time when those were being challenged by protests worldwide during what U.S. historians now call the global 1960s. In these efforts, the program was aided by civilian researchers like the University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Albert Kligman, its biggest contractor. For several decades, Kligman ran a lab at the nearby Holmesburg prison, where he experimented on incarcerated African-American men and offers supposedly experimentally sound evidence for the long-standing claim that black skin is immune to pain and resistant to damage. While working for the program, Kligman was also contracted by Dow to run tests on TCDD, or Agent Orange, after workers at the Michigan plant began breaking out in chloracne, now known as a sign of dioxin poisoning. Kligman assured Dow, the military's largest supplier, that the chemical was entirely safe, for he had observed nothing but, quote, a few minor bumps when he injected dioxin into his subjects, primarily African-American subjects. He was actually quite disappointed, but his examination of these few bumps ultimately led him to discover retinoids or tretinoins, a compound capable of removing those bumps and other fine lines on skin. This finding, which he later patented as Retin-A, earned him and the University of Pennsylvania millions of dollars. It also transformed the beauty industry by ushering in the era of cosmetic pharmaceuticals, those quasi-medical products promising seamless skin to consumers worldwide. So you might have encountered Retin-A if you've ever been to a dermatologist. It really is still considered like the gold standard, right? The fountain of youth. But you might have also encountered it if you're just flipping through magazines, right? Retinol's the kind of non-prescription grade derivative of Retin-A, right? Is found in almost all skin cream products that promise any anti-aging properties. Or you might have just seen it on the subway, right? The only skincare ingredient that matters. At the time, before all of this, Kligman's work helped to clear TCDD for widespread use under Operation Ranch Hand. The program spent over a decade experimenting on captive and vulnerable bodies, extracting biomedical knowledge from their skin, and rationalizing any resulting violence or harm as a necessary condition for biomedical knowledge. They looked for the causes of debilitating skin conditions in Vietnamese landscapes and people, little knowing or acknowledging that the U.S. had brought much of the poison on their own plains. Veterans, though, suspected this immediately upon returning and saw the rashes, bumps, cracks on their skin as evidence of their exposure to Agent Orange. Their suspicions were corroborated by physicians as early as 1979, who found that exposed veterans experienced a variety of symptoms, but the single most common symptom, shared by 85% of the men, was, quote, a rash that was resistant to treatment and aggravated by sunlight, the description of which was nearly identical to what military physicians had called tropical acne. But when veterans first agitated for compensation and pointed to their skin as evidence, Robert P. Nimno, the Veterans Affairs Director under Ronald Reagan, dismissed the charge, claiming the compound caused no more than, quote, a little teenage acne. Examining the work of these wartime scientists in shoring up U.S. military efforts, my book revisits the Vietnam War not to intervene into its historiography, nor to debate the political and tactical efficacy of U.S. military policies, but rather to ask about the legacies of this chemical war, to find its records on the very surface on which it had made itself known, our skin. The scholar J. Prosser once wrote, quote, "It is the phenomenological function of skin to record." By this he meant that we can see the life we've lived on our skin. All our worries and wounds, everything from the scars of childbirth to the wear of work, or simply the passage of time. As someone who's been passing time, I can attest. I can see it on my skin. Skin is the keeper of our histories and memories, and though this record is never transparent, we can learn something about individual lives and collective histories through these skin memories. I see my book as an attempt to capture some of those skin memories, those remainders that reveal to us how history becomes embodied and how it continues as material effect. Though Agent Orange has entered an elite circle of toxic disaster narratives, as Biggs puts it, there's still no consensus about its effects. Through broad-scale activism, veterans in the U.S., South Korea, and Australia have received compensation for a variety of illnesses, but these are characterized as associated with, not caused, by dioxin exposure. Scientists and policymakers continue to debate its teratogenic and carcinogenic effects. And while Congress has accepted limited responsibility for environmental damage to Vietnam by allocating limited funds to clean up so-called dioxin hotspots, areas on bases where the chemical was stored or where it was dumped when they left, it continues to deny the possibility that toxic warfare could have human effects, especially after all these years. And I can talk about a lot more about this, but there's been a lot of work by environmental activists, and in fact, a lot of historians have been working to pour through now declassified documents to find out where these things were stored and to help with remediation. The effects of Agent Orange thus continue to be shrouded in a politics of uncertainty. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on how Vietnamese women at a small spa on the edges of Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon as it's still locally known, responded to this politics of uncertainty. Not with hopes for incontrovertible scientific proof or faith in the possibilities of cleanup, but with a willingness to live with a certain amount of exposure and to accept a certain amount of opacity. How they learned to read skin as both surface and depth, present and past, how they offered care in the absence of cure, and how through their intimate labors they came to grasp the way history becomes embodied, not through direct cause and effect, but through a willingness to recognize harm, even as its origins may be uncertain or ever mutating. To state perhaps the obvious, Vietnamese people have long known about the effects of chemical warfare on their bodies. Vietnamese scientists have been collecting evidence about these effects since the late 1960s, but their findings have been routinely dismissed as unscientific. International researchers have tried to intervene by conducting their own studies, collecting soil and water samples, testing villagers' blood and women's milk. 40 years after the war, they found disturbingly high levels of dioxin and other chemicals in fatty tissue passed along the food chain. So this is a chart of the levels of TCDD that you can find in individual types of food consumed, right? So if you're eating chicken and toad and duck, you can imagine the sort of exposure that you're still exposed to in the contemporary moment. They found an extremely high rate of fetal anomalies in these areas and linked it to inherited genetic disorders caused by exposure to the chemical, passed along through a process called DNA methylation. But providing evidence of continued effects and clarifying possible pathways of dioxin transmission helped to bolster the case for compensation and reparations, and also helped to allay general fears about exposure in Vietnam. But it didn't stem anxieties about contamination. Farmers and fishermen living in these rural hotspots report encountering discrimination at urban markets from buyers suspicious about the possibility of tainted goods. Parents in these areas feared sending their kids to school where they were taunted, sometimes simply because of where they live. Vietnamese families were caught in a bind. Asserting a claim to exposure might give them some access to medical and financial aid, but also open them up to stigma, to fears that their bodies were contaminated, harboring conditions that could affect generations to come. Many residents, as a result, said they wanted no more scientific studies proving dioxin's lingering effects. What they needed instead was some tests to confirm its absence, to assure others that their lands, their animals, their own DNA was clean, and the word is set. How do you get clean, or at least demonstrate your cleanliness, when you've lived through a chemical war? One way is to rebuild. When I was in Saigon conducting research, as I said, everywhere I turned there were these posters announcing the city's various development projects, which pledge a green, clean, and beautiful city. Vietnam was at the time in the throes of economic reforms, and for instance, in 2011, the Vietnamese government began plans to enact massive economic projects like the renovation of the district of Quang Ngai by building a new expressway, the Da Nang Quang Ngai Expressway, which would integrate the province into an east-west trade route extending into Cambodia and Laos. Those of you who remember the Vietnam War, and I suspect there's not that many people here, will remember that Quang Ngai was considered a Viet Cong stronghold during the war, so faced brutal bombings and ground fighting, and that it was the location of the My Lai massacre, one of many mass killings in the area. The project cost over 1.6 billion USD Over 9,000 families were affected by these new land use. 1,500 families would need to be displaced to make it possible. So even with promised compensation, many refused to leave for fear of loss of livelihood, community, cultural practices, and importantly, because it would mean moving their familial graves, which given the area's history were many. In Binsang district, for instance, 180 families were relocated, but over 10 times as many, nearly 3,000 graves, had to be exhumed and reburied. Protests resulted in lengthy project delays, but resettlement was eventually secured and the expressway opened in 2019. But just a month after it opened, massive potholes riddled large stretches of the road, leading to asphalt peeling and waterlogging, making it impossible to drive, so they had to shut down the whole expressway. Fingers of blame started pointing. The VEC blamed it on the volume of traffic. They worked quickly to repair the expressway, but after announcing it fixed, the concrete and asphalt mixture they used disintegrated, peeling off with the touch of a hand. Some residents said it was the poor quality of the work. Others, of course, remembered all those disturbed graves and wondered if restless spirits were not, in fact, the cause of the upheaval. The expressway, like the malls, hotels, restaurants, and resorts that sprung up post-Daimai, was meant to become a new skin, covering over the wounds that had come before. But like many of those other structures, it sat uncomfortably atop what came before. Covering up and peeling off, it proved to be a fragile skin, one that could not fully conceal or contain what lay beneath. Women in Vietnam understood the fragility of skin and the demand for cleanliness, perhaps better than anyone. While cleanliness had long been a colonial imperative, as evidenced by the introduction of things like soap to produce a more hygienic, meaning more clean and fair rather than dark and dirty population, it was also important to Vietnam's post-war modernization. As the Vietnamese state sought economic growth through the traditional program of export production, images of disabled bodies associated with Agent Orange stoked fears about population quality. The state responded by instituting various family planning campaigns intended to encourage the reproduction of fit citizens who can meet the challenges of industrialization. These neo-eugenic campaigns were centrally concerned with reproduction, and thus with women's bodies. Concerns about cleanliness were in this sense also concerns about biochemical inheritance. If the evidence of such inheritances were recorded on the scarred backs of the returning soldier, they have also been chronicled on Vietnamese skin. For women, these marks were seen not just as not beautiful, but as potential signs of illness and reproductive failure. So while men were busy rebuilding the post-war city, women came to places like Calyx, the small spot that became my research site, to rebuild their bodies, to look clean, to look bright, clean, and beautiful, even when they were unsure about what this clean surface might hold. Many of these women, as I said, were employed in service or factory work. Living with the lingering toxicity of war and the newly intensifying environmental costs of rebuilding after war, they saw how these labors wore on their bodies, eroding their surface. They speculated about its causes, looked for remediation, but they also came to Calyx to be reassured, to be reminded that they were living in urban Vietnam, far away from and shielded against the fate of those dioxin hotspots. This is the way many women I talked to understood their relationship to this history and to such places of suffering, as one person described it to me. They deferred their risk onto these seemingly distant sites, even as Saigon sits just outside of one such hotspot, the Ben Hoan Army Base, and even as the entire country, roughly the size of California, offers few places of remove. Yet this imaginative border, which kept danger and distance at bay, was constantly undermined by forces they could not fully grasp. As much as they were drawn to Calyx by its images and promises of beauty, they were also haunted by visions of the not beautiful, the widely circulated images of disability associated with Agent Orange illnesses. Oh, what did I do? I'm sorry. So this is the image of the spa. And these are some of the representations of the so-called Agent Orange victim. And I can talk a lot more about this sort of the limited range of representations, right? And the ways that these images circulate as a kind of a stand-in for the not beautiful, in distinction to a place like Calyx, right? Where you can be removed from those kind of images and those kinds of fears. Whether founded or not, rational or not, fears of a weak and deteriorating body and fantasies of a flawless surface coexisted at Calyx. When women came to Calyx, they were being invited to see the cosmetic pharmaceuticals inaugurated by no other than Albert Kligman, including his blockbuster Retin-A, widely accessible in Vietnam's unregulated pharmaceutical market, as a tool of remediation. They were being encouraged to see their skin, as these military men of science had seen it, as a border to shore up and reinforce, even when they knew their bodies could not be fixed. For instance, I met a woman who came to Calyx every other week. Her arms were red with raised scaly patches, giving the appearance of psoriasis. She received each week a treatment involving vitamin C serum, retinoids, and moisturizing lotions, which made her arms no better and no worse. The woman said the visits made her feel better, that they gave her relief. Before coming to Saigon to be with her son, she was living in Bum Thuc in the Central Highlands. Because of this, Hua, the most senior esthetician, suspected she might have been exposed to dioxin, though she never said so. Quote, I think she must have been near the poison somehow, she concluded about this woman's condition. You never know. Sometimes things come into your body and just rest. And the word she used is namngi, meaning rest. The idea that ailments can reside within a person, sometimes constantly troubling them, but just as often lying in wait until their body is weak before appearing or becoming symptomatic, is a popular notion in Vietnam. It's an idea that draws on Eastern medicine's conception of etiology, which tends to see the connection between a condition and its manifestation indirectly. But it also shares commonality with concepts familiar to us, like latency in Michelle Murphy's terms, or slow violence in Rob Nixon's influential formulation, which offers an understanding of the ways toxic effects may be displaced out of time or out of sight. At Calyx, so much could rest in one's body: the residues of dioxin, DDT, chlorine, and chromium, the strains of poverty and political neglect, the work of forest spirits, and the actions of unsettled ancestors who suffered bad deaths. The heat, sun, dust, the smoggy skies, the dirty water, wind, cold, germs, and ghosts. Ideas about causality drew on multiple and interlinked epistemologies and worlds: the dead and the living, the present and the past, the visible and invisible. It was these resting agents that made their skin weak, as Hua often said. Discussions about resting poisons and other speculations allowed women to access distant or displaced causes of their present ailments. When I asked the older woman if she had heard stories about ancient Orange, she said, of course. But she did not pay much attention now that she lived in Saigon, so far away. Now that her previous losses, 2 of her children had passed away, one during childbirth, seemed so long ago. Sitting in Hua's chair, what the woman who came week after week to little visible effect seemed to want most was the relief she got from Hua's ministration, her touch. Touch was an important source of knowledge and care at Calyx, if not ultimately cure. So often, when examining a new client, Hua would hold her hand on their arms or neck to gather information about their internal state. So often, Nya would gently place a poultice on a girl's back, rub a lotion over a woman's body, squeeze a point on her feet to release qi, or glide her hands back and forth over a troubled spot as if she could will it away. Once I saw Nya, another esthetician, giving a massage to an older woman in the communal room. This older woman and Nya were exchanging stories about their children when the woman shared that her youngest daughter suffered from extremely dry skin. Nya encouraged her to bring the girl in, and a few weeks later, when the girl arrived, she saw that her entire upper body was covered in flaking skin. The mother said they had tried antibiotics and tretinoids from the pharmacy. At the mother's urging, the girl had also gotten vitamin A injections from the clinic, but there had been no improvement. Nya gently washed her body and covered it with lotion. The girl remained silent, only answering yes when Nya asked if her body hurt. The other guests offered up advice. One woman recommended she stop bathing until the condition cleared up. Another volunteered that her niece had had the same condition, which eventually subsided. She said to try nettle tea. The mother asked Nya to recommend some products from their shelves. Nya touched the girl's back, and said only that she should keep cool and dry. Her body was too hot. As it turned out, the girl worked at a leather manufacturing facility on the city's edge. Only 16 years old, she had been stitching bags and belts for over a year. Nya told me she had seen such dry, cracked skin before on workers in the city's leather factories, and confirmed this with the girl's mother. Nya did not know what caused it, only that it would not get better until the girl stopped. Chromium, the chemical commonly used in leather tanning, can cause a range of environmental and health effects, including respiratory problems like asthma, but most commonly skin conditions like the girl's apparent dermatitis. Consistent exposure can lead to lung and nasal cancer as well as infertility. Chromium waste dumped into water systems can circulate those effects along the food chain, which only extends the risk for workers already exposed to it daily. Chromium combined with other chemicals in already contaminated water can exacerbate those effects. Many of the women who came to Calyx were employed in apparel and textile work, which in some measure financed their visits. Women who populate these factories touch and smell chemically treated textiles for long hours day after day. Some came to Calyx to relieve their tired muscles, others to access the luxuries their labors afforded, and still others, like the girl above, to attend to conditions they could not resolve. These women often spoke about back pains and tingling fingers, itchy eyes, and brittle skin. It's just the work, they would say, though sometimes they were specific about the causes of their troubles. One woman who sewed T-shirts at the Tyson factory, one of the largest in the area, said she realized only after years that she was allergic to the chlorine used in bleaching cotton. I did not know why my hands were cracked and bleeding some days, she recalled. The woman's family used to run a tailoring shop. As a child, she had learned sericulture, but she said, laughing, "We do not use silk at the factory." Polyester, which is not bleached, gives her hands some relief, but in the dim light of the communal room, everyone could see that the cracking reached up past her elbows, appearing on her shoulders and chest. She volunteers for polyester orders whenever possible. When she came in, Nya rubbed her hands with vitamin C and covered it with a moisturizer. She wrapped it in a silk cloth. It was a curious gesture to me. Wrapping in silk certainly did not appear on the spa's detailed list of services, nor did the poultice of herbs not placed on the girl's body. Nya carried on her everywhere, it seemed, a bag of herbs she used in various ways, usually made into a tea. She took from this bag some herbs, which she soaked and placed on the girl's back. She knew this girl could not leave her job at the leather factory. In a place hailed as a temple of choice and selection, this girl could not choose the most promising, perhaps the only remedy for her illness. Nya knew no lotion could save such a troubled surface. She sent her home with some free samples nonetheless. She said, with surprise and confidence, "Try nettle tea." If this girl lived elsewhere, she may have seen a dermatologist, but save for the visit at the clinic for her injection, she had not seen any doctor at all. Dermatologists, as I've said, are not widely available. Still, it would not have been unusual for this girl to be cared for mainly by her mother, as women are traditionally expected to care for their family's health as a part of their everyday work, and to rely on local knowledge as much as sometimes more than formal medical knowledge. This helps to explain why a woman might bring her sick daughter to a place like Calyx, why a family might direct their financial resources there, and why a place selling the curative powers of Western science relied so heavily, as Nya seemed to, on the methods of traditional medicine. "Sometimes I'm not sure what to do," she told me. "I follow the procedure, use all the techniques, but doesn't really help," Nya confessed. In those moments, Nya might turn to a story about a neighbor who suffered from a client's condition, a recommendation for a cream, a remedy passed down from a guest's mother, even a dream about an improbable event that somehow came to be. Or recall a suggestion: try nettle tea, eat ginger, visit this pharmacist in District 2. Make peace with your brother. The worry is not good for you. Nya's work on the seamstress with the chlorine allergy is a good example. When the woman came in, her hands hurt to the touch. The vitamin C and moisturizer Nya rubbed on her stung before settling in and offering her some relief. But the cracking, scaly skin that reached up her body was so intensely dry that the lotion only produced a momentary break. Nothing could change her hands until Nya curiously wrapped it in silk. It was one of the regular customers in the communal room who brought in the silk cloth. She had heard the woman talking about her chlorine allergy and her memories of making silk. The customer was a tailor who worked from her own home. She gave Nya 2 small squares cut from a larger piece she had used for making a wedding aoyai. Put it on her. Her skin will remember what it's supposed to feel like, she urged her. Nya hesitated. When she finally put it on, the lotion she had applied soaked through the cloth, causing it to stick to the woman's hand like a second skin. For that moment, at least, her hands did feel like silk. It was not a cure. The cloth which covered her skin only masked her condition. But nor was it a pretense at transformation. The silk did not give any false assurance that her hands and the ailments that reached up her body did not exist beneath. It only made her skin more impenetrable. This was probably not the change the woman came to Calyx for, and what her skin remembered we will not know. But in that moment, it did feel different, perhaps like the silk she remembered from her childhood, or maybe like the silky skin advertised by cosmetics corporations. Nya could not make this woman clean, wiping away all evidence of her past, stamping her surface with the seal of good health. She offered her instead a cover-up, a way to live in and with a world beyond repair, beyond the false promise of the makeover. Nya's acceptance of skin's opacity keyed into a different epistemology of skin than those shared by the military scientists I write about in the first part of the book. While Nya continued to experiment with forms of care, skin was not her mystery to solve. And while she too wanted stronger skin, she did not imagine the body as something that could be secured. She recognized that the things that come to rest in your body can become intractable. Attempts to remove the old and the unaesthetic, be it on the body's surface or the city's surface, will thus often remain incomplete. Skin remembers. J. Prosper may have written it, but it was the women at Calyx who really understood it. Observing their intimate labors of beauty making, I came to understand the continuities of history as a structuring presence in our social relations, our landscapes, and our very biochemical makeup. This is what I think we mean when we talk about an afterlife. We mean to talk about those residues of the past that have to be hidden away to make the surface shine. Skin memories can capture those remainders. Here, they allow us to access the chemical afterlife of the Vietnam War by drawing our attention to processes of historical contamination, by which I mean the ways in which our present is infected both by chemical residues, always, which have notoriously long lives, but also by the past itself. These contaminants are often difficult to identify as they circulate and merge with new forms, but we can see the traces of them in those boxes and boxes of photos of feet, crusty, pus-filled paddyfoot at the National Archives, which led me to the history of dermatological experimentation during the Vietnam War, including on the battlefields of Vietnam. We can see it on the backs of returning soldiers and their insistence on biomedical and political recognition for their experiences with chemical warfare. We can see it in our medicine cabinets, filled no doubt with cosmeceuticals fabricated from these experiments on incarcerated individuals, soldiers, prisoners of wars, and other captive subjects. Even in the flawless surfaces of men and women today, inheritors of an epidermal regime that says our worth is measured not just by the color of our skin, but its clarity. I want to encourage us to see eruptions of that which seem out of time or out of place, whether it's the multi-million-dollar expressway riddled with potholes and peeling asphalt, or the soldier's shoulders streaked with red rash and the back covered with acne, as records of the past, as an archive to mine, to see, in other words, how deep skin really is. Thank you.
the discussion portion of our talk today. So I will be sharing this.
Wow, thank you so much. That was truly beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I have the pleasure of being able to ask, I'll just try to keep it brief. I'll just ask sort of 2 questions to sort of get us kick-started, and then we'll sort of move on to questions from the audience and also questions from the chat. And Doreen will sort of moderate that dimension of the conversation. You know, I think your work is just such a really sort of beautiful model for thinking about across various kinds of disciplinary boundaries, making it sort of quite clear that fields like Asian studies, as it has sort of emerged within a sort of area studies and Cold War context, Asian American studies and American studies as it has as fields that have historically come into being through somewhat kind of national terms. Your work really sort of provides this, you know, really sort of incredible model of thinking across these sort of boundaries, really sort of troubling their own sort of epistemologies and you know, sort of how they kind of emerge. And I think that these sort of disciplinary, thinking across these sort of disciplinary spaces is how we're sort of envisioning this sort of conversation after area studies. And so I just wanted to kind of invite you to maybe sort of talk a little bit about your own sort of intellectual trajectory, how you sort of place your own work, and then, you know, I'll sort of ask all my questions at once to make it a little easier.
Sure.
And you know, I was also sort of thinking about just the sort of incredible archive that you've sort of brought together, both of, on the one hand, these sort of U.S. military archives, the sort of stunning photographs of bodies, and then also thinking about the, I think as you put it, sort of intimate labors, the kind of care work of Vietnamese women, and you know, so I'd love to sort of invite you to sort of talk a little bit about this archive. It's a very sort of trans-Pacific archive in many ways. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just sort of invite you to talk about that. And then sort of finally, I think I was, you know, we were sort of thinking, I was sort of thinking a little bit about the sort of kind of political, I guess the political needs of our current moment. It's really hard not to feel the ways in which this work really resonates with the brutality of our own moment, and in particular the Atlanta shootings in 2021. And so I just wanted to sort of invite you to sort of talk a little bit about if, you know, maybe how this work, even as, you know, the sort of violences as they're sort of articulated in the sort of legacy and the material memory of the Vietnam War, but the ways in which it sort of resonates in the present.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much, Denise, for those questions. And, you know, I'll say off the bat that I do locate my work in this sort of tradition of what is being called now the Trans-Pacific Studies or Global Asia Studies, which has been so indebted to Denise's work, right? You know, one of the early books that actually called the name, right? Gave name to the ideas, and that would become this field that a lot of us are now working in. And, you know, because of this kind of new conceptualization of something like a Trans-Pacific or a Global Asia, we're able to think about, you know, this kind of region in a transcultural and transnational context, you know, that expands beyond sort of political entities occupying specific world regions, and to think about the kinds of flows that, like Denise's work, was already mapping out many years ago. So, you know, I'll say after that I'm absolutely grateful and indebted to your work. And my own contributions to this field have been alongside other scholars who have really revisited the histories of Pacific wars, particularly the Vietnam War, and I've really opened it up beyond the traditionally state-centered approach of military history to questions of labor, gender, affect, among others. And I think my contribution in thinking about the body, right, and emphasizing the role of the body and the role of the skin, is to think about the body as a kind of an archive itself, right? So I'm working with all these different archives, right? But I also want to conceive of the body, your body, my body, right, as an archive, because part of this project for me is not just thinking about the entanglements of US soldiers and the Vietnamese and Asia and the US in the historical, right, but thinking about how that actually sets the conditions of possibilities for us in the contemporary moment, right, and how all of that, right, you know that funny phrase, what stays in Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? Well, it doesn't, right? And what happens in Vietnam does not stay in Vietnam, right? All of these toxic materials return to us, right? In the clothes we wear, the catfish we eat, and the toys we touch, right? And that we are all sort of living through this kind of toxic imbrication. Right? And I think my project here was to try to think about the kind of prehistory of that and to kind of give certain ways of emphasizing and honing in on that. And the body, right, is a particularly useful one for me because it is the repository. Right? It is the repository of all these things. And, in that I've been really influenced by work in history and anthropologies of the body, history and anthropologies of environmental studies, right? In fact, it was Samina Molla's book, which some of you may know, The Violence of Care, which is about sexual assault forensic exams, right? Women who undergo forensic exams after sexual assault, which alerted me to the ways that our bodies hold evidence of violence. Right? And yet also how difficult and even violent it is to try to perceive these effects, right? And to try to think about this as a moment to reflect on a different ethic of care, right? To think about how we might actually be able to recognize harm beyond these technical, medical, legal procedures that often reiterate violence, right? And to your question about the archive, I think, I was trained in the interdisciplinary field of American studies, and I always feel funny saying trained as if like somebody, like I was like a dog, like. And actually, that's not really how learning works, by the way. But I was trained in interdisciplinary field, and so I'm like neither fish or fowl, right? And the entrance into the archive for me was a really fortuitous but also scary encounter, right? And often when I talk about this book, people ask me if it was really hard to encounter these difficult things in Vietnam and to talk to women about these kind of difficult stories. And yes, absolutely, it was so hard, right? But in some ways, it was harder for me to encounter an archive in which sort of these military scientists, right, with no compunction and no sense of ethic, right, it seemed like, would write things on the margin like, this is the best way to eliminate Vietnamese, right, in their archival. And it was then that I really understood what historians, real historians, right, call the violence of the archive, right? It's gut punching, right, to encounter these documents, because it's not like you're a sort of like a stereotypical evildoer who's like, wah ha ha. It's, men doing research, right? Men trying to build the field of dermatology on the backs of captive populations. Men who actually understand their work as necessitated by violence on other people, right? And that's what the experience of the archive has been for me, right? And that archive is a living archive, right? I think one of the things that happened, this book came out last year, so it was not exactly the height of COVID, but we were definitely still in Zoom land, right? And everything I was saying in this book about, the need to critique science, the importance of speculation, right? The idea of the multi-causo, the imbrication between different epistemologies, metaphysics, right? The need to learn through touch, right? Just seemed all wrong, right? Just seemed all wrong for the moment. And I felt very disciplined back into place of being like, no, everybody believe the science, put on your mask, right? Don't stand near each other and definitely don't touch, right? And so I think that's what I mean by the ways in which we live the historical present, right? That like we can bounce right back to that place, right? Very quickly, very easily. And your last question, Denise, beyond the archive, was the politics, right? The political question. I think it's it's a hard question, and it's a question I think a lot of us, all of us maybe in this room, especially in this moment, think about. I feel like we're living through this moment, which I would hesitate to say is unprecedented or entirely new, but is a culmination of the convergence of many crises, right? Obviously, over 1 million deaths in the last 2 years related to the pandemic alone. Inflation like we haven't seen, like we're like rocking the 70s again, right? The lowest rate of home ownership in decades, accelerated warming of the planet, extreme weather events. Why is it so hot today? Food insecurity, return to mass policing after a year of protests that it looked like it was going to turn us in a totally different direction, and on and on and on. And, I feel like we live in a moment with so many challenges, and our political leaders seem to have no ideas about how to address these challenges. And as scholars, I feel like our job is ideas, right? And we really need our humanists and our social scientists to be able to produce work that can push through some of these policy logjams, right? That can give us a kind of recognition that all those things that I've just said have deep histories. And every single one of those things is us living the historical present, right? And just to give an example from the fields in which many of us, like all of us up here are working, right? The kind of anti-China hawkism that I see running through this country, that is the one consensus, right? One consensus issue for Democrats and Republicans, right, is really, really scary. The only other consensus issue for Democrats and Republicans is militarism and the need for military spending. Like, we cannot get off either one of those points, right? And of course, these are connected, and we know how they're connected, right? They're connected in the ways that, in some of the ways that I've mapped and you've mapped in your work, and all of us have mapped. And so I think scholars in the field of Asian and Asian American studies should have something to say about this, not just to condone China or its policies, but to shape a dialogue about the U.S.'s relation to Asia and to the rest of the world, grounded in deep historical and cultural knowledge, right? And I think that's just the beginning of some of the things we can do. One of the things that I write a lot about in the book is the ways in which the university is actually a collaborator, right, in militarism, in a lot of this violence. And it was this professor at Penn, this professor at NYU, this professor at Miami who taught them to do that. But a lot of us, and many of you in the room, have also been trying to think about how the space of the university can do something different, how we can leverage some of the resources of the university to do something else. And I think that's the challenge for us, right, as scholars in this moment, right? Whatever it is we care about writing, right, and I think it's probably all brilliant, all the stuff you guys are working on, right? We're all kind of collectively in this space that has the potential to contribute to collective problem solving, right? And I think, the challenge for us is to figure out how to do that, how to collectively problem solve.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful.
Yeah.
and kind of eye-opening, and I think speaks to a lot of the generational concerns that we talk about in our classes here at Northeastern. So now I want to invite questions from the audience. I'd like to collect questions in threes, and then we'll turn it to the chat. So if you have a question, could you please stand up and speak for the room, and also introduce yourself by giving your name. Thank you so much.
Hi.
My name is May. I'm a second year International Affairs and Cultural Anthropology major. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. This has been truly wonderful. My question goes back to the Cleveland studies and your focus on the vulnerability of Black bodies. So in what ways do ideas of Black bodies being immune to pain, illness, or vulnerability further facilitate racial capitalism and toxic regimes of labor today? And then furthermore, what role does the cosmetic and pharmaceutical industry have in compensation and recognition of harm caused due to past experimentation?
Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Michael Thornton. I teach Japanese and East Asian history here. Thank you for a fabulous talk, and thank you both for organizing this series. Every one of these has been more wonderful than the last one. One thing I was really struck by, and I'd be curious to hear a bit more about, thinking about imagery, and particularly imagery of skin, all I could think of were photographs of people with keloid scars after the atomic bombings.
Yep.
And then a couple decades later, sort of victims of various environmental pollution cases, like Minamata disease in sort of Western Japan, cadmium disease, things like that. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how just the visual representations of skin conditions, I guess, or how you see kind of the Vietnam moment as fitting into a kind of a broader history of whether it's military representations of the kind of effects of warfare, or just more generally kind of the depictions of deformed bodies, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do we have one more question from the audience for this set? All right, then I'll invite Professor Tu to respond, and then we'll turn to the chat.
Okay. So I'll start with May's question first, which was such a good question. Thank you. And, I think that the way you put it is so exactly right, that Black bodies and the continuing exploitation of Black bodies, right, under racial capitalism, under toxic regimes of work, right, I think is so absolutely true and so absolutely a part of the legacies. And in the Klickman chapter, I actually trace it all the way back, right, to the early ideas about, even in the 1700s, right, this idea that Black bodies somehow are immune to pain, right? And the idea that we can map civilizational status, right, along a pain nexus, right? The most civilized are like the most frail and the most vulnerable to pain, right, down to like the most primitive and the most orientalist, right, are the least, right, perceptible to pain. So this idea has a really, really long history, right? And what I was trying to show in that in the Klickman discussion is like what happens when those cultural ideas get codified into science, right? Sort of get the imprimatur of science. So this is really the moment, right? And the moment where dermatology as a medical field emerges, right? And gives sort of credence to these sort of cultural ideas, right? And, and part of what I think we need to understand is this is not just about like racial science, for instance, right? It's about thinking about the ways in which different institutions then reproduce racial ideology. And here I was looking at the medical institution, but also the institution of the university, the institution of corporate science, right, reproduces, right, racial ideas. And so part of the work that I was trying to map out, or the question I was trying to ask is, okay, why do these ideas that actually don't make any sense, right, that kind of always fall apart? The idea that Black people are invulnerable to pain, given the rate of Black deaths at the time, right, of Kligman's experimentation, right, and the disproportionate rates of mortality and immortality for every medical index, childbirth, right, exposure to cancer, et cetera, right? All this kind of data that says the opposite. How then do we continue to have these ideas, right? How do we continue to nurse these ideas? And not to mention all the political activism, right, that particularly those that erupted during the civil rights movement in the global 1960s to really push back against these ideas. How do they continue to live on? And for me, it's these institutions that really continue to reproduce such that it becomes common sense for us to know certain bodies as disposable or, you know, just better suited for toxic work, right? You know, one of the questions I asked is like, why were Black soldiers disproportionately in the front of the lines, right? Disproportionately killed, disproportionately exposed to disease. Well, ironically, it's because they were considered invulnerable to these very same conditions of harm, right? And so part of this work, to answer your question and tracing it back to Kligman, is thinking about one specific moment, right? Which we were able to sort of midwife, like racial ideologies, from a moment of potential transformation to then reproduce it in a very similar frame. And the cosmeceutical industry has never thought about reparations, right? And in fact, what the cosmeceutical industry has done also, we can trace back to Kligman, in this convergence between cosmetic and pharmaceutical, is actually open all of us up, right, to increase toxic exposure through things like skin creams, right, through makeup, right? And so the kind of toxic regime that I sort of trace back to this moment is only expanded so that it's not just Black people who are vulnerable or Asian people or white, it's all of us, right? And Michael, thank you so much for your question about imaging skin and the keloid scars and atomic bombing and all that. You know, in the book, I spend a little time thinking about when do these images really emerge, right? And for years, Vietnamese had been fighting for reparations, right? Or fighting for remediation. And in fact, they ended up suing Dow Chemicals. Well, they sued the United States, but in a very useful law. Apparently, the United States does not have to hear cases against itself, right? So it was never, the case was never heard, right? And actually was struck down by the same judge who awarded U.S. soldiers $180 million compensation for their Agent Orange related claims, right? And so decades, and about 2 million Vietnamese signed on to this lawsuit, right? And so at the time I was there, right, it was sort of the trail end of the lawsuit. They had gone as far as they could and it had been struck down and they were never recognized. They've tried to sue Dow, right? They've never been recognized in the legal framework, right? So as these kind of legal battles sort of like wound down, right, you saw a really growth of other kinds of production. So the widespread images, so there were a lot of books, short stories, right, letters like that were being sent out. So as the legal claims died, the moral claims, right, that these images were a part of a growing moral claim to remediation. And I really see the images, and I think there's some, I don't know as well the Japanese context, right, but I think that there is a similar pattern of using these images to kind of bolster a moral claim, right? As activism in other spheres continually fail, right? And I think there's a couple things that happens, right? One is that it's a pretty effective moral claim, right? Because we're immediately, right, invited into a position, right, where we see these kinds of images and we feel sad, we feel pity, right? We feel maybe even guilty, right? Maybe we even feel complicit, right? But the problem with the visual image as moral claim is then, of course, we position, right? the subject in a particular way, right? That they could never have their own agency around these kinds of questions, right? And that pity, right, is part of how we want to, that they will live in our moral imagination, right? And so the debate around Vietnam at that time was really like, no, I don't want any more of that. I don't want anybody else giving me tests or testing my milk, right, and making me promises about compensation, giving me medicine, and then like leaving when the studies were over, right? I want to tell everybody I'm actually clean. Don't worry about me, right? So you know, Agent Orange illness became a kind of biomedical identity, right? That once you get recognized in the biomedical sphere in this way, you become this thing, right? It's hard to become anything else, even as you really want biomedical recognition, right? It's hard to become anything else once you become recognized, right? And that's part of the kind of Janus face work of the visual images, right? You know, and it was the images, but there were also performances, and they would do tours, right, where they would visit orphanages with disabled children. But once you become that thing, it's really hard to become something else.
Are there any questions from the chat?
Yes, there are. The first question is from Joy Garza. I'm a postdoc in anthropology at Harvard. Dr. Tu, thank you so much for this fabulous talk. Can you tell us more about the socioculturally specific notions of modernity in Vietnam as it relates to skin, beauty, and feminine personhood, and how this has changed, if at all, since the time of your field work? I have a second question. Would you like to hear it now, or do you want to answer this question first?
What do you want me to do?
How about we take another question?
Okay.
Yeah.
This is from Megha Prasan, who is a CSSH undergrad. Throughout your research, what were some practices you employed to process the traumatic experiences you discovered while maintaining focus on translating your findings into an academic piece?
Okay. So I'll start with, thank you so much, both out there, for the questions. I'll start with Joy's question first. The question about changing notions of femininity and modernity in Vietnam, and this is something that, of course, you know as a cultural anthropologist that's being explored in other areas. So I think of Dredge Kang's work on in Thailand, right? But I will say that you know, when I first started doing this project, before it really shifted, you know, I would say that I'm studying the beauty industry in Vietnam, and people would say to me, oh, are you looking at the skin whitening creams? They really love that there. And, you know, I heard this again and again, you know, they love to be light there, right? And, you know, they really value lightness there. And it's true, there's a lot of skin whitening, and there's a lot of ads for skin lightening and all that. You know, and there's a value on lightness, right, as opposed to darkness there, much as there is here, right? And so what I did was I actually wrote this piece to sort of dispense with that discussion that didn't end up in my book, and it was called White Like Koreans, right? Because it was a way for me to try to understand what lightness or whiteness means in this particular context, and to not assume that it was just a kind of a colonial legacy, right? And I ended up in that piece thinking about the ways in which whiteness and lightness in the Vietnamese context was very much attached to ideas of Korean and Japanese modernity, and particularly Korean economic dominance and cultural dominance in Vietnam, right? So the big popular culture in Vietnam is, of course, like K-pop, the dramas, right? Just stick K in front of everything, and that's what you're looking at in Vietnam, right? Supermodels, all of that, right? Also, Japanese popular culture was very, very sort of popular there. Also, much of the economic development in Vietnam was funded by South Korea, China, and Japan, right? And so in that piece, I made the argument that we really need to think about race, right? Something called race, not just in a national frame or even in a transnational frame, but in a kind of a regional frame, right? And to think about, you know, the changing notions of modernity, right, as very much about a kind of regional discussion and debate, right? And so, you know, has it changed since I began my field work? I think in some way, yeah. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Right. So I think the presence of Korean culture has only become stronger. I think the interest in lightness and whiteness continues. But what I really wanted to emphasize in my book was that look just below the surface, right? Look just below the surface and you're gonna find something else, right? And, you know, I can say this because I'm not a real anthropologist, right? But sometimes I think I'll speak for myself, that when I borrow the methodologies of anthropology, I feel like I can sometimes fall into their traps, right? Which is just to carry a lot of my own assumptions, right? And to use my site as a kind of illustration, rather than to think about how the theory is actually embedded in the data itself, right? And to really, really think about how the granular, right, and the spectral and the hidden actually is the thing that alights. And the second question about practices employed to deal with my own trauma, you know, and I'm not sure I'm so great with dealing with my own trauma, and so, in general, but I think as I started saying, you know, I think one of the hard things for people who are sort of 1.5 or immigrant or even second generation, right, scholars who go back, and the field is a home they used to have, where they have, you know, family members, right, where they have neighbors that they still know. There is a lot going on for you, right? And there's a lot of, and in this particular case, you know, there's a lot of strange insider-outsider dynamics that emerge, right? But I think the overwhelming feeling for me when I was there was not so much trauma, but sort of a kind of, I don't know, almost a sort of survivor's guilt or something, right? You know, there's not so much difference between me and anyone else I was talking to, except the like one fateful decision by my parents to leave. Right, and you know, in a lot of the book, I talk about how, you know, the politics of renovation, the idea that renovation is not the same as repair, right? That there's a lot of fixing up that we have to do, right? And I write a lot about that isn't about sort of curing something, fixing something, right? Some things can be fixed, but they can't be put right. That was one of the things that that Hua said to me. You know, you can fix some things, but you can't put them right. And in Vietnamese, the words are very similar, so they sound almost the same, but they have these very radically different meanings, right? And you know, for me, living in that space, right, of knowing that, you know, a lot of people are doing this work of renovating, right? You know, Ruthie Gilmore always says, like, poor people are always renovating. There is no elsewhere for them, right? There is no somewhere else they can go, right? And for me, it's that confrontation of like, what kind of renovations do I do, right? Even as I have left. And what is that kind of ethic of renovation, right? What are those things that I can do, right? Because I'm not doing this kind of renovation, right? So that was much more the overwhelming feeling for me, other than the kind of like, you know, it is really, really hard to do some of this work. I know that all of you know that, because all of you are doing this kind of work. It does take a toll on you, right? Because you're not insensate, right? And so I don't think I'm unique or this condition is unique. And in fact, I feel like what I was writing about is not some sort of spectacular scene of violence, right? What I was writing about is the slow accretion of something that's hard to describe, that's hard to perceive, and yet is so palpable.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it back to the audience here to see see if anyone else has questions. Please stand up and introduce yourself as you say your question.
Hi, I'm Eric Edberg. I'm a third-year cultural anthropology major. Something that stood out to me in your work was how, even as late as the second half of the 20th century, there was sort of like this supposedly scientific work that was very legitimized as scientific, when in reality it was just based on a lot of falsehoods and racial stereotyping. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more or share some more of your insights on how those kinds of ideas gain scientific credibility so effectively in such recent decades.
Yeah, I think I mentioned in the book, you know, the handbook on in the American Journal of Medicine is still prescribes less pain medication for Black patients, right? Still reiterates the fact that Black skin is thicker, right? And so why have these become, right? And one of the things that I realized, and the sociologist Anne Morning has written about this, is like in our worlds, right, there was something that happened around the cultural turn, right? And like race became a construct, right? And in the Boasian tradition, right? And that, you know, we all have really come to understand in this world, right, in the last at least several, like 60 years, right, that race is a construct, that it's not rooted in biology, that it is not essential, right? And yet there's an entire other like knowledge world which has never really bought that idea, right? Scientists have never fully bought that idea, right? And so I guess that's what I mean by it's like, it's not that they are, you know, just reproducing stereotypes, right? Or just practicing bad medicine, right? Their kind of epistemological framework never shifted to this view, right? And in Anne Morning's book, which I think is a really interesting, she actually interviews all of these scientists. You know, and this is why we've returned post-genetics to ideas about like, you know, that there's a genetic basis for literally everything. Genetic basis for how fast you are, how slow you are, like your capacity to be a good tennis player, right? You know, and that because we have never, like there is a part of our intellectual world that's never bought that argument, right? And, you know, and I think that's part of what I think could be really productive about, you know, cross-disciplinary discussions in the space of the university, because those people might even be our very own colleagues, right? And, you know, to call them racist, right, is not the end of the story, right? We are operating in different epistemological frameworks, right? What would happen if we could actually have meaningful discussions and debates about this, right? And some of this work is, of course, happening, right? There's a lot of, schools of medicine, right, who are taking on some of these questions, right? But they tend to be much more culturalist, like, you know, Black people tend to, you know, respond to medicine this way, right, rather than structuralist, right? Which is to understand how all of this is based in different institutions and structures already, so that when we're thinking about just the cultural manifestations, right, we're not actually attacking what's lying underneath, right? So some of this work is obviously already being done, but I think we could do more, right? You know, I think we could do a lot more to have a much more robust debate among, you know, people that we have to think of as intellectual peers, right? Not like racists that we can just forget about, but intellectual peers about these issues.
That is a great burden, I think, an intellectual challenge for all of us. Yeah. I'd like to leave time for one more question from the floor and then one more from the chat. Yeah.
Hi, Professor. I'm a sociology PhD student here. So I think it's mind-blowingly great, and I have to read your book to digest your viewpoints deeper. So at this point, I just want to ask, why do you choose to digest this book from the affect perspective? Because I think that's very fundamental to your book.
The affect
Yeah,
perspective?
The affect perspective.
Yeah.
Because I think you particularly want to depict the alternative sense of the wartime. You want to depict the military scientists, the joy of discovery, the harm, or how women they will feel better, even though it's not essentially will improve their skin situation, but they feel way much better. So I wonder, why will you choose this perspective? And I wonder if there's any gendered affect differences in terms of the afterlife of the wartime.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think part of it was the ways in which this sort of lifted up for me from the archival material, right? I mean, traditionally we're told that scientists like write in objective manner, right? They, experiment 12B, 14 subjects, like ages, blah, blah, blah. And yet this guy's writing, so one of the nice things about scientists is like, there's a lot of like things they've written that you can look at, right? And so I read all their papers, right? And I read this guy's paper, and it's like so florid, right? It's just filled with these like excitement and the joy of discovery. And I was thrilled to see the like pustules erupt, right? And it was like, what is happening here, right? And so, for me, that really sort of cracked something open to me about the ways that we know difference through affect, right? And not just these kinds of feelings of excitement or sorrows or whatever, but the affect that is about touch, right? And the idea that we can divide the world between vulnerable and invulnerable, pain and painless, right? Those were ideas that were emerging for me and really highlighted the crucial sort of role of affect in this, right? And then, when I was talking to the women, I mean, one of the things that is really hard about writing about the imperceptible and the accreted is like, it is not a bunch of people sitting around feeling super sad or super traumatized, right? I feel like, it's people who defer, deflect, people who choose not to know, people who know but want to not know, people who, right, people who are actually gathered in a space to try to have momentary relief, to be in community, to be, right? And you almost don't want to pierce that skin, right? But you also know that there is something else going on. And affect for me, really honing on the different affects, right? The kind of like confidence of saying, try T when you know that is not going to help her, right? When you know the only thing she can do is quit that job, which she cannot do, right? Those are the moments for me that just made it feel like it's impossible not to talk about it.
The first question is from Issei Matsumoto, PhD student, history at USC in Los Angeles. Thank you so much for this productive, fascinating, and urgent discussion on your work. Can you talk a bit about medical expertise on the U.S. side? Was there any opposition to some of the medically racist ideas of pro-war medical work within the medical community in the U.S.? And the second question is from Claire Blau Fox. I'm a fifth-year undergraduate chemical and engineering student.
Hey.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how perhaps the difference in medical philosophy, like between Western and Eastern, may contribute to the continued militarism and aggressive attitudes towards Asia, and by extension, Asian Americans.
Oh, such good questions. Claire, thank you so much for that question, also for being here, right? And having this conversation with us. I think these questions are of a piece. I say, yes, there was part of the Letterman Army Institute of Research where the field lab and the field dermatology team were eventually located. During the war, there was massive protests outside their doors, right? And some of it was from sort of like, I don't know, I guess we would call them somewhat fringe groups that, had sort of theories about like, they were creating bombs, right? Or they were experimenting on Asian bodies to then, sort of bring them to the Asian context, and they were making poison rice, right? And some of it but a lot of it was really about this kind of ethical concerns of the role of medicine in military imperialism, right? And so if you remember at all the big case, right, of oh my God, I'm forgetting his name now, who I actually write about in the book. So he's a physician that actually got court-martialed because he refused to train medics, right, during the war, because he did not want to be a collaborator in what he considered unjust violence. So he was actually court-martialed. He used the Nuremberg defense, right, and he was actually a dermatologist, right, and as a result, there was a whole medical resistance movement, right, to try to sort of pressure the United States, right, into withdrawal, right. And so there is that whole sort of legacy. And, and I think if we dig into any sort of historical moment, right, where there are instances of violence and control, there's always instances of resistance to it, right? But the resistance was not, in the end, strong enough. And I think in the end, what happens with military medicine is that it falls right back into line, right? So after the Vietnam War ends, they start doing research in the Middle East, in Iraq, right? They start looking to Afghanistan, right? And we see some of these same ideas about like black soldiers in Afghanistan, right? We see the same ideas about, sort of protecting the body of the soldier, the science of soldiering, right? Continuing on into Afghanistan. And, as we all know, a lot of people were talking about when we withdrew from Afghanistan, this is a replay of Saigon, right? And to me, it's not a replay, it's a continuation, right? And so even as there was a whole developed medical resistance movement, that I think medicine has and continues to be a handmaiden to a lot of this stuff. Claire, your question about Eastern and Western medicine, I speak a little bit about it in the book, but it's such a developed field that I don't take it on fully inside the book. But I do think what you're suggesting, that there is a different way of seeing the body, and that different way of seeing the body actually affects how we work on the body, and both how we care for the body and how we destroy the body. Right? And so, for me, this idea, right, in Vietnamese language, body and person are the same word, right? It's like you don't consider a person's body as outside of their personhood, right? In the way that we can separate body from personhood in a Western context, they're not the same, right? And I think that's sort of fundamental, right? The way that these scientists that I write about, cannot see a person in the body, right? Can actually be delighted at human suffering because they actually don't register that there is a person there, right? Or they can actually witness what must have been excruciating pain to be injected with dioxin and to actually not observe the pain, like to be able not to see it, is a fundamental split to me between body and person, right? And I think that fundamental split makes it really hard to practice a kind of ethic, right? And there are other obvious differences too that I talk about, which is about, in a lot of Western medicine, we're always searching for the cause, because once we have the cause, we can find the cure. Right? But what if the cause is many things, right? And that's why Western science is stumped by things like irritable bowel syndrome, right? It's like, what, is it food? Is it brain? It's like, there are so many things that Western science can't understand, right? Because there is no one cause, so there is no one cure, right? And that approach actually is also very different in the ways in which you will, you will approach something, right? If you think of your life as being really embedded in your landscape, in in the water you drink, right, in a kind of an entire ecology, and that you're not separate from that, right, you will treat that entire ecology very differently, right? And these are ideas that are shared in many post-colonial contexts, in indigenous science, right, and that is shared in many, many different scientific traditions that we find less, less common in a kind of a Western scientific framework. And Claire, you're right. How we approach this, right, actually has a lot of both political and ethical effects.
Thank you so much. I think this is a great moment to close the talk and thank Professor Tu once again for coming to Northeastern, for giving such an amazing talk, and for writing such a powerful book that has changed all of our minds here today.
Thank you so much, everyone.